Psalm 144 represents a milestone. With Psalm 144 this morning, we reach a plateau, a landmark. In front of us is the top, the summit of the Psalms. 145 to 150 are a unit. All those hallelujahs, beginning with probably the most chanted of all the Psalms, the Ashrei, which we'll look at week after next as we move to the end. But 144, Bible scholars will teach, was as if it was the conclusion of the Psalms, with 145 to 150 as a unit tagged on. It's a conclusion in that the close of Psalm 144, the last verse is Ashrei, happy. The opening of Psalms, Ashrei ha'ish asher halo halach ba'atzat resha'im, happy is the person who has not walked in the company of the wicked. Today, the closing line, Ashrei ha'am shekachalo, happy is the people for whom this is so. Ashrei ha'am sh'Adonai lohav, happy the people when Adonai is their God. Those may be familiar words because they are tagged on to Psalm 145 when it's part of our liturgy, when it's part of the Ashrei prayer. And so Psalm 144 this morning brings us to a certain quality of closure, but more, a certain height. The theme of Psalm 144, which we study today in honor of my teacher and friend Michael Nadelson, and I'll say more about Mike toward the end, the themes of Psalm 144 are war and peace. I will look to spend a little time talking about why so much of the Psalms is focused on battle, on war. And then we'll look at the closing 4 verses of today's psalm, which provides the ideal of peace. And what are the components of that idyllic, longed-for time, post-war? The psalm has 3 sections. The first, part A, we'll look at in a moment, is battle ready with the help of God. Part 2 is the request for victory. And then the last, verses 12 to 15, are we at peace. And I emphasize the word we because in this first section, even in the first 2 verses, the first 2 verses, see, I got to pull up the psalm now. This is what happens when I'm thrown off by technology. I don't get aligned. Let me pull up Psalm 144. So in the first 2 lines of Psalm 144, the suffix, which is the chirik, the dot, and then the yud, which equals me or my, will appear 11 times. Tsuri, chasti, umitsudati, miskabi, umufalti, li megani chasiti, ami. That's verse 2 mostly. It begins with the me and will conclude with the we. And so, together, Psalm 144, happy the people when Adonai is their God. For David, blessed is Adonai, my rock, who trains my hands for the battle, my fingers for the war. My loving kindness and my fortress, my high tower and my rescuer, my shield in whom I shelter, who subdues my people under me. Adonai, what is a mortal that you know him, or the offspring of a human that you consider her? A mortal is like a breath. His days are as a shadow that passes. Adonai, tilt your heavens and descend. Touch the mountains and they will smoke. Light lightning and scatter them. Send forth your arrows and confound them. Send forth your hands from on high. Release me and save me from many waters, out of the hand of foreigners, whose mouths speak falsehood, and their right is a right of lies. God, a new song I will sing to you. On a harp of 10 strings I will hymn to you. Giver of deliverance to rulers, releaser of David, God's servant, from the sword of harm. Release me and save me from a hand of foreigners, whose mouths speak falsehood, and their right is a right of lies. While our sons are as saplings well grown from their youth, our daughters are as corners carved after the fashion of a palace. Our storehouses are full, dispensing from harvest to harvest, our flocks from thousands, myriads in our outside areas. Our leaders are laden, no breach and no going forth, and no outcry in our broad places. Ashrei ha'am shekachalo, happy is the people for whom this is so. Ashrei ha'am sh'Adonai Elohav, happy the people when Adonai is their God. So this psalm begins again with the me and ends with the we. We don't know its composition, and the medieval commentators will differ from the Septuagint, that early Greek writing translation of the Bible, which we talked about yesterday as the earliest translation. It will identify this as David relating to the battle with Goliath. Likewise, the Midrash Socher Tov, an earlier rabbinic commentary by the 10th century, will identify it with Goliath. Medieval commentators Ibn Ezra and Radak will identify it with David, assuming the authority as king. But although this is for David, we will see David referred to here in the third person as well in verse 10. Giver of deliverance to rulers, releaser of David, God's servant. David Avdo, that's the third person, David, his servant. And that will point to a later time, not necessarily written by David, but by a king identified with David's struggles. And back to this emphasis on war. David's career will begin with Goliath. It will begin, well, first it'll begin with the lyre, that little harp singing for Saul. But it will also include going to battle as a youth. And David will be told that he cannot build the temple for God. So the prophet Nathan will say, because your hands have been bloodied in battle. His life is that of fighting. And so throughout the Psalms, this image of war will be repeated as Psalms are identified with David and his struggles. There will be 10 different authors attributed for Psalms, and David will be close to half of them, entire body of Psalms. And so I begin with the question of why so much battle? And I pause to appreciate that as I open the newspaper or watch, I see a common theme, and the common theme is battle. It can be, in some cases, violence, accounts of shootings. It can be disputes between in the moment, Democrats and Republicans over bills before Congress. But the notion that rule, governance, and political life is that of struggle. And even for David and for later rulers, that of war is reality. And to not acknowledge it and to see the need to overcome those struggles is to not be attuned to the harshness of life as lived. There are battles. And so we begin here with verse 1 for David. Again, the symbol of the one who fought to unite, the first king to unite the 12 tribes, and the one who also sang to God, the sweet singer of psalms. Blessed is Adonai, my rock, tsuri. And the image of a rock, particularly in an ancient time, is a defense, a shelter, who trains my hands for lakrav, the battle, my fingers for the war. Now, that's not unusual kind of poetic symmetry of clauses, but the commentators will see these as two different kinds of resources. Hands for the battle, yadai, my hands, is krav. Samson Raphael Hirsch will say the same root as karov, combat up close. Karov means near. My fingers, that's botai for the war, so trains my hands for the sword, up close fighting, my fingers for the war. And here the commentators will understand where fingers come in from the bowstrings of the bow to David's sling to spears being tossed. My loving kindness, verse 2, will echo Psalm 18, verses 2 to 3. And of all the Psalms, this psalm is closest to 18, which will describe God in battle and people in battle. And clearly the thrust, the flow, is that success in battle for David. Success in battle relies on God. It is ultimately God who will prove the source of victory. And yesterday, talking to my teacher and friend, Rabbi Jack Reamer, he pointed out that yesterday we focused so much on the word tzaddik, often translated as righteous or just. H.L. Ginsburg, the great Bible scholar who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, will say that the word tzaddik in Psalms relates to victory, that God is the source of tzaddik, the source of tzedek, of victory. And here, a number of identifications for God, which again is similar to and a little different than Psalm 18, 2 to 3. My loving kindness, my fortress, my high tower, my rescuer, my shield in whom I shelter, who subdues my people under me. I now pause to say that on one hand, we read Psalms to appreciate the psalm as an artwork, as a flow, as a canvas. At the same time, I'm often fascinated by how individual verses will be pulled out and quoted in certain needed contexts. Psalm 1, who trains my hands for the battle, my fingers for the war. In the Latin, the Vulgate translation from the 12th century on, will be written in Latin on swords. So the swords of the Crusade, for instance, the imperial sword of the Holy Roman Empire, created in 1198 on display in Vienna's Hofburg Palace, will have verse 1 carved onto the sword used by the imperial sword of the Holy Roman Empire. Verse 2, now going forward in time, will be quoted in Saving Private Ryan by Daniel Jackson. in reference to war and God's protection. Verse 3 and 4 are quoted in our Yizkor service, that service that begins our memorial recited on holidays. Adonai, what is immortal that you know him? Or the offspring of a human that you consider her? Immortal is like a breath, his days are as a shadow that passes. So here too, verses 3 and 4 are chanted in synagogue and familiar. But in the flow, back to the canvas is that I depend on you, God, to prepare myself for battle. Verse 1, I depend on you because you are my shield, my high tower, my shelter. And I do so as I get ready for war, knowing that I am fragile. I am a mortal. Here today, gone tomorrow. Or as my wise mother would say, we are all here for a visit. I am transient, which is also elsewhere in Psalm 8, verses 5 and 6, as now the shift on this canvas to God, display your power so that I will be victorious. Adonai, tilt your heavens and descend. Touch the mountains and they will smoke. That's an image found elsewhere. Tilting the heavens is also in Psalm 18, 10 to 17. And God is in the heavens. That's a repeated theme. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, would see the mountains as a metaphor for one's enemies who seem to loom so large. But you have the ability, God, you the creator, to touch mountains and to make them smolder. Verse 6, lightning, Baroque, Barak. And Baroque, the verb of lightning, lightning, is unique to this psalm in all of Bible. And I'll point out there will be other unique words as we move forward. And here the image is an ancient myth. We see that same image of Zeus in Greek mythology with the bolts of lightning as the weapon. And so lightning is seen throughout ancient mythology as God's arrows. Confound them. Verse 7, send forth your hands from on high, release me and save me from many waters. And here too, many waters is understood metaphorically as danger, as swarming enemies out of the hand of foreigners, often translated B'nai Nechar, as well as aliens, those who threaten me. And how do they threaten me? And now a shift, which we saw in Psalm 143 and 142. They threaten not just with sword, but with the tongue, whose mouths speak falsehood, and their right is a right of lies. Now, yamin, right, usually refers to their right hand. Miminam is a right hand of lies, which here conjures the image that even when they swear, take an oath in God's name, they are misusing your name, God. They are liars. And now, pointing to the future, Elohim. This is the only time the word Elohim is used in this final book of Psalms. So much used earlier, particularly in the second and third book of Psalms, but here the only time it's used in the fifth book. A new song, Shir Chadash Shira, a new song I will sing lach to you. Benevel Asor Azamra lach, on a harp of 10 strings I will hymn to you. This is looking to the future. Usually this phrase, a new song, It's used 3 other times in Psalms. 33:3, 96:1, and 98:1 is at the beginning of a psalm in the context of extended praise. And so the image of let me sing a new song is let there be a new beginning, a new opportunity for me to praise you. The rabbis of the Talmud will say in reference to Nevel Asur, a harp of 10 strings, in Arichin 13b, will say this is an instrument that will, normally in those days, a lyre had 4 strings. The harp of 10 strings will be in a messianic era. 10 and 11, as we're looking forward to this description of the future time. Giver of deliverance to rulers, releaser of David, God's servant, from the sword of harm. Release me and save me from a hand of foreigners whose mouths speak falsehood and their right is a right of lies. And so that line is repeated from verse 8 to emphasize. And what comes through is that the foreigners are dangerous because of how they speak falsehoods. And here, where it's foreigners, the classic Jewish commentators will say that that can also refer to the heretics, those who disavow you, God, among us. It doesn't necessarily have to be foreign nations. It can be those among the Jews who have disavowed loyalty to you. And now the close, verses 12 to 15, a description of an ideal. While our sons are as saplings, well grown from their youth, as if there's no interruption in their ability to become strong. The first ingredient is young men who are strong, well cared for, well educated. Our daughters are as corners carved after the fashion of a palace, pointing to daughters who are beautiful. In Greek construction, there were these graceful female figures employed as pillars in architecture. They were called caryatides. Some of the translations conjure the image of the daughters who are like those pillars of these beautiful women, as if to say, may our women be both beautiful and supports. Though historically, that form of architecture seems to be long after the writing of the Psalms, and some will understand this as may they be Rashi, cornerstones, namely supports after the fashion of a palace, strong supports. Samson Raphael Hirsch, Germany, 18th century, will translate it as nooks, namely hidden away, essential, but yet modest. So one can read in. But what is clearly being conveyed is may our daughters be supports like of a palace, suggesting beauty, suggesting a quality also of not needing to necessarily, of modesty, not necessarily needing to be front and center. Our storehouses, mizavenu, this is a unique word. And I got down into a rabbit hole in the concordance this morning, because when we chant grace after meals, we say, Hazan et hakol. We chant about God, and we use this word zan in verse 13. I was surprised to learn that in the whole of Tanakh, the word zan only appears here. So it's so familiar from our grace after meals, but it's not clear what it means because it's only used here. Mizan el zan. Our storehouses are full. Ma'afikim means dispersing or dispensing. Dispersing from harvest to harvest. That's the understanding of Rashi on the word zan. The concordance simply calls it ochel, food. The image that Rashi says is that may the harvest be so great that you have to empty out the harvest in order to make enough room for the new harvest. Dispersing from harvest to harvest, our flocks from thousands, myriads in our outside areas. And so the third and fourth image of the ideal are sons and daughters who are strong and beautiful. May the storehouses of produce be full. May our flocks be in abundance. And the fifth, here too, a word that is obscure. Alufenu mesubalim, our leaders are laden. No breach and no going forth, no outcry in broad places. I changed this, you may see from my translation at the last moment. For most of the translators translate this as alufenu as either as referring to the enclosures of the animals, verse 14, and referring to either translating it as cattle or as oxen or as domestic animals. But the word alufenu appears in two other places in the Bible, Exodus 15:15 and Zechariah 12, verses 5 and 6, to refer to chieftains. And therefore, the Talmud in Brachot 17a will quote this verse and say it refers to our leaders. And in fact, it will say that when the students left the hall of Rabbi Chisda in Babylonia, they would chant, "May our leaders be laden, no breach, no going forth, no outcry in our broad places," as the blessing of praise of their teachers. And that there's calm. And in the Talmud in 17a, there will be an explication of laden means laden with mitzvot. No breach and no going forth, which means that there will be, and they'll cite the examples in the Talmud of the disputes that David had with his advisor, Achitophel, or Doeg and Edomite, so that there will be no breach in the ranks. And so, an important teaching of the Zohar on this verse, who will also understand it to be alufenu, not about oxen or domestic animals, but about our leaders. And the Zohar, commenting on Parshat Ve'et Hanan, will say that the greatest of our good fortune is dedicated leaders who are dutiful, who see themselves as accountable to God, and therefore seeing all Jews who they serve as fellow siblings. And now that last verse, the culmination. Ashrei ha'am, happy is the people, shekachalo, for whom this is so. And here too, the Zohar will do a little gematria in Rehem Mehemna, the commentary on Parshat Bahar, will say that kacha equals 300, shekacha equals 345, which is the gematria for Moses. Happy is the people for whom Moses is to them, which can again suggest not only Moses as the model leader, but Moses as the giver on behalf of God of Torah. Happy the people when Adonai is their God. That phrase echoes Psalm 33:12. Ashrei Hagoy, happy is the nation, Asher Adonai Elohav, who has God as the God, Ha'am Bachar, chosen by the people, Lenachala Lo, as God's inheritance. And so the psalm has a trajectory, acknowledging war, acknowledging the role of leader as one who seeks to create peace. But here, this psalm says that peace can only be achieved with humility of a leader. The humility that knows that one's power, one's ability to exercise the tools of war, which is to say, the leader here is not relying on God to fight the war. It is reality grounded, that the reality is that one has to go into battle with one's hands and one's fingers, but knowing that the ability to use one's hands and one's fingers to wield the instruments of battle depend on wisdom, depend on God. And rather, in this than describing the dangers or the violence, it focuses primarily and gets repeated on the greatest of threats, that of lies, of the misuse of tongue, and that a king, a ruler, a political leader, must learn also to use his or her own tongue wisely. And then the reward. And the reward will lead, I choose to read verse 14, to good leadership, who are laden with what? Maybe mitzvot, but also laden by feeling the responsibility on his or her shoulders of the community. And only a leader who feels the weight of community, who is laden, can lead. And that leads to no breach of responsibility, no going forth either to one's own needs or breaches within the ranks, no outcry in our broad places. And these words, outside areas, are often translated in verse 13 as fields, and Rechavotenu is often translated as our streets, but more literally it's outside areas and broad places. There's the sense of, back to the other Psalms, Min hametzar karatiyah, I called to you from narrow places, ubemerchavya, and you answered me from expansiveness. That the trajectory here is of feeling confined to peace feeling like expansiveness of space. And that enables the people to experience Ashrei. The word Ashrei, I noted, is the beginning of Psalms and culminates here. And that is, the word Ashrei is more than happiness in a moment. It is to feel all those things that are described: safe, able to nurture, able to feel that one's physical needs are met. And then Abravanel, the great teacher of Spain, Portugal, and Italy, in that transition moment of the Inquisition, Abravanel, who would advise the kings both of Spain and Portugal, will say this psalm leads to the culmination, which is that after all physical needs are met, true happiness, the ultimate goal, is to feel in relationship to God. Happy is the people for whom this is so. Happy the people when Adonai is their God. And with that, I'm going to pause to take some of your reactions and then to add some more thoughts to pull together this phase of Psalms. Richard, I saw your hand first. Go right ahead.
Okay. I see something here that as we first went through the psalm that struck me as something of a dissonance. And so my comment is not critical, but it's just an observation, if you will. One of the last things you were talking about was the humility of a good leader. And I'm drawn back here to verse 2, and that was the subject. When he says, "Who subdues my people under me?" and he uses Ami there. And to me, there's a dissonance of why, unless it's pointed at another people, why would he feel that the population would need to be subdued under him? But anyway, there's several ways that could possibly go. And I just thought I'd put it out there and see if you had any further thoughts on it.
So I just want to pick it up to show the verse that Richard's referring to. And it's the last phrase, Haroded ami tachtai. And the word roded is another one of those kind of obscure words. And I will add, Robert Alter, before I get to Robert Alter, Sadia Gaon, an important teacher of Babylonia, will translate it as peoples in the plural, and it's in the context of the other peoples. And so therefore, Robert Alter will translate it as tramples down peoples and takes out the word my from it, which also answers your question and points to the tension. And others will also, Benjamin Siegel will even use a stronger translation to rodade, and he'll use the word crushes my people under me, much stronger. And so the question you raise is a sensitive and an important one. Where is the humility, and why would a king want to crush his own people? And I would, and again, it's all the interpretive spin, I would tend to see it as a leader who relies on God to create the harmony of the people under his leadership. So for me, it's less tense. For a leader to lead, the people need to be united and see the leader as the leader, and therefore subdued under him or her. And again, it all comes down to this word, rodade, which, as we've seen repeatedly in Psalms, the poets often choose obscure words that is subject to many nuances of understanding. All right, with that, some other reactions to this psalm. Ahuva ho. Always look to hear your thoughts. Go ahead, Ahuva.
Concerning verse 2, in fact, the Targum reads not my people, but peoples in plural. However, more important to me is that I noticed the similarity, and it's very, very close similarity with chapter 18. And chapter 18, in my mind, I studied it very carefully and I gave a talk about it. I think it was definitely written by David. And I think this one, 144, is also the fruit of David's writing. And because they share a lot of motifs, and especially the motif of water. The water is very important in both Psalms. And words like Maim Rabim, a lot of water, much water. Also, you mentioned also the verse 2, Chasdi, Sal'i, Metsudati, Mefalti, Tsuri, Metsudati, Magini. All these are also in chapter 18. There are more to say, but that's for now.
Well, thank you, Ahuva. Again, I always value your scholarly insight, and clearly Psalm 18 is the most similar of all the Psalms to Psalm 144. And scholars In your case, a scholar, Ahuva, will therefore identify it as written by the same hand, namely King David, in your case. Others do suggest that it was inspired by Psalm 18 and not necessarily written by the same author. And they'll point again to the phrase in verse 10 in terms of referring to David Avdo, David his servant, in the third person, as a reason to think it was a later king for whom 18 reflected, but not necessarily so. And that's the work of scholars to make those distinctions. I'm gonna look to see if there's one last comment, then I'm going to turn my attention to my friend Michael. I have two participants raise their hand. I don't know who the other is. Maybe they've spoken. So then, without seeing a hand, Chuck, go ahead. Last comment, and then I'll pull it together, and we'll give Michael the last word. Go ahead, Chuck.
One quick comment on the word krav, verse 2.
Yeah.
The close combat taught by Tzahal is called krav maga.
Right. And that's the martial art, the
Exactly.
word used for martial arts that come out of Israel. So this word krav, and actually it's the first time I thought about it in terms of, you think of krav as fighting or battle, but it has the same root, as Samson Raphael Hirsch pointed out, as karov,
Yes.
which is why it's hand-to-hand combat or up-close combat. That's right. So let me just say a few things here that point toward a later composition, and that is, at least in the Oxford commentary, which is by Mark Brettler, professor who taught at Brandeis University, and I think then he went to Duke more recently. He points out two words that are grounded in Aramaic, which would point toward a later composition than King David's time. One is the word that Chuck just focused on, lakrav, he would say is an Aramaism. Also, the word patsni, potsein, occurs 3 times in the psalm, verses 7, 10, and 11. He too would say that is an Aramaism, and therefore pointing to a later composition, echoing earlier, but written later than King David. This psalm has unique words, as I pointed out to you. Baroque, the only time it's used as a verb, the lightning as a verb. Verse 13, with the mizavenu, and even the word zan. Zan here uniquely used, and alufenu. And last, verse, that's it. Verse 14, alufenu. And so to pull this together, I want to share a quote from the Talmud, because it brings to mind my teacher, Rabbi David Lieber, who was the editor of the Eitz Chaim. And when he would speak at graduations at Ziegler, this was what he would quote from the Talmud, and it's the paragraph right before what I quoted, which was the students of Rabbi Chisda would say when they left the study hall, "May our leaders be laden, no breach and no going forth, no outcry in our broad places." But there's another blessing, and this is what the students would say in leaving the study hall of the other teacher of the day, Rabbi Ami. Some say it's when they left the hall of Rabbi Hanina. And this is what they would say: "You shall see your world in your life, and your end shall be for the life of the world to come, and your hope for many generations. May your heart ponder and achieve understanding. May your mouth speak wisdom, and may your tongue bring forth song. May your eyelids look straight before you. May your eyes be enlightened by the light of Torah, and may your face shine like the brightness of the sky. May you lips utter knowledge, and your kidneys rejoice in righteousness, and may your feet run to hear the words of the Ancient of Days. I choose to conclude this study today with my blessing, echoing Rabbi Lieber, echoing the study halls of Babylonia to each of you who've stayed in this course of study, knowing that other study halls would echo Psalm 144. Closing is to honor Mike Nadelson. Mimi said that this psalm represented Mike well before we began, and that Mike always has a smile on his face. And this is a psalm of hope making. It leads to an idyllic time. I just wanted to say, Mike, what I've always admired is your love of learning, stretching yourself to continue to learn Jewishly, to take on new things like chanting of Haftorahs and doing it with color on your page so that you can chant. And that what you and Annie achieved are two daughters, and Danielle and Gabby, who have gone on to be leaders of Jewish community at Hillel and Camp Ramah. And I know that their commitment and contribution is due to Annie and due to you and your ongoing love of learning. And so it felt right to include you among the honorees, Mike. And so I give you a closing word about love of study. Mike's a former teacher in high school also, who left Stanford Law School during the Vietnam era to teach high school. So a closing word, Mike, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, Mike. Closing.
I apologize. Basically, when you left to go to the synagogue, I got disconnected, and then I couldn't get back on, so I missed the beginning part of the setting of the Zoom class. But I kind of caught on. I went back to the original and got in. I really appreciate your honoring me, and I really enjoy learning from you all the time. It's a pleasure, and I will miss you for sure. And I hope your next chapters of your life are as fulfilling as the last 33 years have been here at CBI. Unfortunately, I've only joined, I was a member of Temple Beth Shalom in Long Beach for many years. And even though I was living very close to you and we carpooled together, but it's been a joy to get to know you even better as I've come to be a member of CBI. And so thank you so much, and thank everyone for all their good wishes as well. And I'm looking forward to do the Haftorah on July 24th for Et Hanan in honor of my father's yortzeit. So my mother died on Shavuot. My father died on V'net Hanan, and Gabrielle and Danielle's bat mitzvah was Yitro. So on all three occasions, it was the reading of the Ten Commandments, which I have to believe was not an accident.
Well, thank you, Mike.
In many ways.
Thank you, Mike, for your ability to overcome obstacles as a role model for all of us, and your love of constancy, of taking care of yourself, and of study. And so I'm glad we could include you among the honorees.